So one of the most noticeable things you'll see if you've been looking at all of the new information for the next Diablo 4 expansion is just how much has changed in terms of items, in terms of balancing. We obviously got big changes like the skill tree overhauls. Pretty much everything you can think of has changed in some way, and some things have been pretty much completely overhauled. And when it comes to uniques, these are one of those things that are very close to being a full overhaul of how uniques used to previously work. Not only in just that a lot of the uniques have gotten their unique effects changed in some way, but also just how unique items fundamentally work now. So I want to go over these kind of fundamental changes to uniques and also go over some of the big changes to some specific generic unique items, so usable by all classes, and also go over one or two that are new generic uniques, because there's also going to be just tons of new items added into the game in general. Now, one of the things that you'll notice on uniques, and more specifically all items, is that there are no longer implicits. I don't remember what they were specifically called in game, but I think most people just know them as implicits or something else like that. These would be the rolls that came on that item type. So on boots, you could get, after you evade, you get a movement speed buff, or you have more charges of evade, or you can reduce evade's cooldown by hitting. Those were the implicits, and it doesn't seem that any items have those on them anymore, but it does also seem that most of those implicits are going to be rolls added to other items. So more specifically, those boot rolls I just went over are seemingly going to be affix rolls you can just get on items now. So that's going to be a pretty decent change to all items, but even more so I think to uniques, because some uniques could even have multiple of them. And that's a good segue into one of the first generic unique overhauls, which are the Pentine Greaves. And what these used to do for their special effect is you leave behind a trail of frost that chills enemies, and you deal more damage to chilled enemies, a multiplicative damage increase. One of the other interesting parts is that the implicit on these used to be that evade would give you the increased movement speed, but evade would also give you unhindered for 2 seconds, which was also unique to these boots. But since there's no implicit, they kind of built in some of the other aspects into the unique effect. So now going into the expansion, the unique effect of the Pentine Greaves is you are permanently unhindered, which is a massive buff, and leave behind a trail of frost that chills enemies. Your chill effects cause enemies to take increased damage from you, up to 50%. So I think the multiplicative damage increase from the chill effects was nerfed, but you are now permanently unhindered, which means you can freely move through enemies. Nothing can block you, which is actually a quite strong effect by itself. But the other thing you'll notice about these items is that the stats are very different than what they used to be on Pentine Greaves. That's because the other really big change for uniques is they are not statically rolled anymore, or more specifically, you can get any affixes on them now. And this is actually quite important, and one of the big reasons they did this is because there's going to be so much elemental switching of skills that it would break a lot of uniques in the game. Because a lot of uniques, and more specifically a lot of the class uniques, not a generic one like this, would be a lot of the times buffing up the main element of a specific skill, because there wasn't a lot of elemental switching previously. But now, because most skills you can elemental switch and maybe even switch the element multiple times, and because you'll be able to just completely override how skills work, that a lot of the unique affixes that we previously had just really wouldn't work. You would get a unique for like a specific build using this skill, and if you change a variant, that unique may just not work anymore, which would be very bad for build creation. So now uniques just have randomly rolled affixes, and while that may also sound bad in certain elements because it's random, as we'll go over in a future video when I go over the Roger Cube, we have some pretty deterministic ways to get the rolls we want on items if you want to use the resources to do that. So this is just a pretty massive change that will make a lot more sense when you take into consideration all of the other changes coming with the game. No more implicits on any items. Uniques now have randomly rolled affixes, and a lot of the uniques' unique effects have been changed in some way or even completely changed. Now, another generic unique I want to go over that got a pretty big change is the Banished Lord's Talisman, which was essentially the Overpower necklace. And the unique effect of this has been changed. One of the stats we get to see on this is actually really interesting if you haven't seen this yet, because there is a multiplicative shadow damage increase on this that's up to 24% as the kind of base roll on this necklace. There are multiplicative affix rolls now, and there are a bunch of them, and you can get multiple of them on the same item. So there's like specific damage increase multipliers. So this one's to shadow. There are just all damage multipliers. There are damage over time multipliers. There are a lot of new affixes that are going to be very strong. And this one just randomly has it on it because, again, uniques now have randomly rolled affixes. But it is quite interesting that you will be able to get pretty strong affixes now. But the unique effect of Banished Lord's Talisman has been changed because Overpower has also been completely overhauled. So previously, the Banished Lord's Talisman was after you spend 275 of your primary resource, your next core skill would overpower, and overpowers that also crit would get a massive damage multiplier just for having the necklace on. But overpower has been completely overhauled, so this gets a pretty heavily changed unique effect. So now, after you spend 275 of your primary resource, gain 4 stacks of overpower, which we'll go over. Your critical strikes deal up to 17% multiplicative damage increase for every stack of overpower you have. So it still has a similar effect and theme, but because overpowers change, this has to change. Now, overpower has been completely changed in that now overpower increases your damage by 15% per stack. And this isn't multiplicative. This is currently additive. I don't know if it's going to stay that way or not, but this stacks up 4 times and each stack lasts for 4 seconds. So at a baseline now, overpower is completely different and much weaker. It's just a stacking damage buff anytime you proc an overpower, and it's not like this big multiplier on top of other things you were doing. So the old ways of overpower kind of being a double crit doesn't exist anymore. Overpower is just this damage buffing stacking effect. But I think where overpower is actually going to be interesting, and they're going to be able to balance it a lot more easily, is adding effects like this. And most likely any of the classes like druids or necromancers that had overpower effects previously are now going to have probably a bunch of upgrades for skills that work with overpower or specifically do some other effect for overpowers. There are probably going to be a bunch of uniques like this one that give you something else based upon how many overpower stacks you have. Overpower to baseline is going to be much weaker, but I think there's going to be a lot more interesting effects that build on top of it. And this necklace is also going to be quite strong as well. And I could very much see this necklace being something that you turn into a charm, which is a craft in the Harager Cube, and use this special effect as a charm because of the massive damage increase. Because if you have other ways to keep overpower stacked pretty readily, even outside of this, if you can't always have 4 stacks just from this, you will then be having a massive critical strike damage increase. Because if you can keep 4 stacks of overpower pretty much at all times, this would be a 72% multiplicative increase for your critical strikes. And unless crit's really hard to build now, which I don't think it will be, you will be able to get builds that basically always crit. So this can just be a pretty massive damage increase, but also pretty interesting in how they had to go about changing this because overpower has been overhauled. And then next I want to go over a few of the new generic uniques, both of these being rings, this one being the signet of Pelgain. And what's also interesting is, as I was going over before, there are a bunch of multiplier affixes now. This one has a 7% multiplier to all damage. It can roll up to 10% and a up to 30% damage over time multiplier. So this ring is actually probably a pretty good roll. But the special effect of this is your freeze effects cause enemies to permanently take 20% multiplicative increased damage for each second they are frozen. So this one is obviously only going to be applicable for a handful of classes. You can still get chill and freeze effects through other items, so every class can technically use this, but only certain classes are really going to be able to make really good use of this. And this could be very strong if you just have ways to very quickly freeze enemies. And even if you can only freeze them for a few seconds, they will now permanently take massive multiplicative damage increases from you forever. So pretty much everything outside of, say, a boss, because I don't know know how freeze works specifically with bosses when it comes to this, pretty much anything else you could pretty easily freeze. If you have something that could just freeze them right away, this thing is going to be a pretty massive damage increase. Then we have the Sliver of Hate. And I will say that because this has a scroll down on this item, I can't actually see if this is a generic unique. I'm pretty sure it's a generic unique though, because the special effect is chance on being hit to unleash hatred, fearing, and inflicting a good chunk of corrupting damage over 5 seconds to surrounding enemies. So this is actually quite a unique ring. The corrupting damage over time at a base could possibly make it pretty good, especially if you can get a bunch of damage over time scaling or corruption damage scaling. The damage over time of this may be pretty good. It adds a pretty strong fear effect, and if you're a tankier build that wants to be in melee and wants to be getting hit a lot, this thing could be proccing to just keep this damage over time effect on enemies. So while I don't know how well this damage will specifically scale, if this damage is at all decent, this could be a pretty good ring to use. It also has a decently unique effect that you want to constantly be getting hit to proc this effect to CC and put more dots on the enemies. There's also probably going to be some pretty big synergies with some other damage over time effects that could make this really strong for the damage portion specifically. And this is just the first bit of unique items we've got to look at. We do have screenshots of a bunch of other generic unique items, but I didn't want to go over absolutely everything, and a bunch of them are very similar to what they were previously and just not super exciting. So much of Diablo 4 is changing, and that's one of the main reasons I wanted to go over a lot of these changes I went over in this video, because so much is changing that even if a unique has basically the same unique effect it previously had, it's still going to work in probably a much different way because the rest of the game has just changed so much. And I think that's actually something that's going to be very exciting because it realistically is going to feel like a new game in so many ways. And I think that'll just be something that is very refreshing. But that's all I want to go over. So thanks for watching.